Salsola tragus. The nickname of this plant is Afro. This is part 1, and in part 2 I'll be sharing a mnemonic or memory technique to help you commit to memory the most distinguishing characteristics of this plant for identifying purposes. Be sure to watch all of part 1 so that part 2 is understandable. This is a bushy plant. It's got many branches. It's usually a little taller than it is wide. It's round or spherical in shape. And this obviously is where the plant derives its nickname from, Afro. It forms large, dense mounds and is usually up to 4 feet tall, 6 inches to 4 feet tall. Some of my sources even indicate that it can grow up to 6 feet tall. It's very spiny. Here we see some of the leaves. They're all like AWL, or some of the younger, smaller leaves are described as being thread-like. These spines are also referred to as, or can be seen as being, the bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S, the bracts of the flowers, because the flowers are found at the axis of the leaves and the stem, or the bracts and the stem. During my research, I find that some of the sources use these terms interchangeably. I'll explain more about that later. Now this picture shows us one of the tender tips, which are edible. Here, before it becomes too spiny. About pea size. You will take your index finger and thumb and pinch off the tender tips here. The new growth, new shoots are also edible. Now this picture shows us two things. One, that among many other environmental locations, this plant could be found on beaches. Details of all of this can be found at survivalplantsmemorycourse.com on the fact sheet of this plant. Now these purple, or I should say pink to reddish looking parts, up close, as you will see, can be mistaken as being flowers, but in fact they are fruit. The flowers are much smaller and develop into this larger fruit, and the fruit can be cream colored, green, pink, red, purple, or even orange. In this case, we see that the fruit bears a reddish color. In this case, the Afro bears more of a cream color. The fruit does, that is. Here are some younger plants. I chose this picture because in the field, don't be too concerned about identifying the smaller plants because they hardly look like an Afro. But in the area, there will be more mature plants. As you see here, large mounds, dense clusters. The more mature plants, you'll be able to utilize the tips for edibility purposes, the whole plant for medicinal purposes, and by wandering around or searching around that area, you'll find younger plants as well where the new shoots, not just the tips, but the new shoots, tender, are edible as well. spiny. Large, dense mounds, many branches. They eventually dry and turn brown. Common name, tumbleweed. The tumbling of this plant after it matures and breaks off at the base tumbles with the wind and deposits its seed along its route to further propagate the plant. Now, this is a close-up picture of the flower, not the fruit. As I was saying before, the flowers develop where the leaf or bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S, meets the stem. Now this third leaf or bract, from this point on I'll refer to these leaves, some will call them leaves, but technically they are bracts, which are bracts in botany refer to leaf-like growths which are at the base of the flower. So these bracts are 3 in number. We see 2 here, and 1 is pointed towards you. And this plant is being described or characterized as having flowers which grow at the axis of where the bracts meet the stem. This is a side view. We have 2 bracts here, 1, 2, pointed, sharp, 3, 1, 2, 3, and the flower is here. This is a close-up of the flower that generally has 5 stamen. These are the stamens. This is another picture of the stamen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yellowish. They could also be somewhat cream colored. 3 bracts. This particular stem has short, stiff hairs. The stem can also be smooth. This is a picture of the fruit, not the flowers. The flowers eventually develop into these fruit, which can be a number of colors, as I said earlier. Cream colored, red, purple, orange, pink, and even a pale green. Still, at the axis of where the bracts meet the stem. Now this black and white drawing shows us a few things. 1, how the stamen, which are generally 5, extend beyond the sepals. Technically this is a calyx, but without getting into any detail, the calyx and sepals are sometimes used interchangeably. On the fact sheet, I do refer to this as sepals. So the stamen extend beyond the sepals. Oh, let me do something here, and as it refers to the mnemonic coming up in part 2, I should mention that this picture, believe it or not, represents pus. Pus of a pimple. That during our mnemonic you will discover how this pimple pops. And I wanted you to see this, to see how graphic this is. It resembles pus, and as the stamens extrude beyond the sepals, represents sort of a popping outward. So carrying on, we have an upside down view of the fruit. Inside here is the seed. This is a top view of the seed, which is cone shaped, flat topped. Actually, as we see from the top, it's coiled. We'll see an actual photograph of the seed coming up. But from a top view, which will be covered by like a translucent membrane, papery membrane, through that you will see this coil, which is flat topped. The stem is rigid, somewhat serpentine or curvy, re-emphasizing the 3 bracts, and the flower develops into the fruit, which we see here, which has the single seed. Each one develops a single seed. Now, this fruit, as you see, this is a good point for me to explain part of the mnemonic that's coming up. So this slide, or probably the next slide, let me see. I think this next slide, nope. Carrying on, the stamen, which protrude beyond the sepals that I was showing you earlier, are persistent. They persist. As you see here, this is the translucent papery layer. More of the same fruit. This is the slide that I was looking for. Now, in the mnemonic coming up in part 2, the afro is represented here, because when you see an afro in the field, this from point to point to point represents the afro. When you see an afro in the field, the mnemonic is asking you then to cut, give this person a mohawk haircut. So you're going to need to shave all this part out, shave all this part out, give this afro a mohawk, and here you go. You have a mohawk. Now further on, and by the way, I generally don't get into this much detail in part 1, but this is pretty important. I need for you to visualize this as you listen or read part 2 with the mnemonic. So we have the mohawk here, and this fruit represents the scab. You have to read about that. As I explained earlier, you saw the stamen, which represents the pus. You have to, tune into part 2 to learn all about that as well. There's also some blood, which I will specify or detail a little later on. More fruit. This is a good place for me to explain the blood part, where the stems are always striped, either with red. The stems have red stripes. They can also have a creamy, yellowish type stripes. The reddish to purple is represented by the blood from the forehead. Part 2 is necessary to understand exactly what I'm talking about, but and the pus represented by the creamy stripes. It's another reddish stripes, mohawk, a scab is the mohawk. This junction where the two meet represents the forehead, which is talked about in part 2. Flowers develop into the seed. The seed is flat on top, cone shaped, and this flat top represents the smooth skin explained in or talked about in part 2, smooth skin. Reddish to purplish stripes, blood from the forehead, yellowish to cream pussy color. These mnemonics need to be graphic, folks, in order to commit them to memory. It's another picture of a less mature plant. Has no flowers, no fruit, no seeds, but it can still be identified by the striped stems. Worst comes to worst, you could pull this plant up and see if whether or not it has taproot. Generally, I don't include too much detail, especially in the mnemonics, concerning the root, unless there is a poisonous look-alike that could help you distinguish it from anything that might harm you. But this plant has no poisonous look-alikes. So if you come across a plant that has striped serpentine stems, curvy stems, multi branches, all like leaves, you know the rest. You'll have the tumbleweed or the afro plant. Tender tips, edible, new shoots, as well as the seeds can be roasted, ground in the flour. For more details about the methods of preparation and harvesting parts of this plant, visit survivalplantsmemorycourse.com and click on the link to Salsola tragus. The tumbleweed is the common name and afro is the nickname, all on one link. This has been part 1. Thank you for watching, and in part 2 will be featured the mnemonic that will help you commit to memory the most distinguishing characteristics of this plant for identifying purposes.